Hey, it's April 20th, and before we get to today's episode, I just want to give you an update on the mass shooting in Nova Scotia that happened over the weekend. At least 19 people, including an RCMP officer, are dead after a gunman went on a shooting spree over the course of 12 hours from late Saturday night until Sunday morning. The suspect is 51-year-old Gabriel Wortman. Police say that during the spree, he was wearing at least part of a police uniform and driving what looked like an RCMP cruiser, but they've confirmed that he was not an RCMP officer. Wortman was killed in a shootout with police at a gas station outside of Halifax on Sunday morning, and the RCMP said today that there might be more victims because they haven't had a chance to fully investigate all the crime scenes yet. There are 16 of them across the province, and some of them were set on fire. This is being described as one of the worst acts of mass violence in Canadian history. The investigation is ongoing. We should have more information by tomorrow, and we'll cover it then. But that's it for now, and on to today's episode. Canada is still weeks away from easing economic restrictions, but some European countries that are further along in their COVID-19 outbreaks are slowly letting businesses open up and sending kids back to school. Germany, Denmark, Austria, Italy, and Spain are a few of the countries that have now cautiously lifted some of their restrictions and are letting some people go back to work. And they're all trying to strike the balance between the need for economic action and preventing another spike in infections. And Canadian leaders will be watching what's happening in Europe for blueprints of how we can go about bringing the economy back to life here when the time comes. Today, Global's Europe correspondent Redmond Shannon is back on the show. He's going to take us through the different approaches that European countries are taking and what lessons Canada might learn from them. I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to Wait, There's More. Hey, Redmond, how's it going?
Hi, Tamara. I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thanks so much for doing this. So, Redmond, European countries are slowly starting to reopen their economies, and let's start with what that looks like. Why don't we talk specifically about Germany to begin with? So they're planning to let smaller shops reopen this week, and they're planning to start reopening schools in early May. How exactly are they going to go about doing this?
Yeah, so starting this week, you have stores that are 800 square meters or smaller. So that's in old money, that's about 8,000 square feet. So let's say medium-sized supermarket, anything smaller than that is pretty much free to open now in Germany.
This shopper in Frankfurt says she saved enough money. Now it's time to go out and spend.
But social distancing rules are still very much applied. So groups can only be up to a maximum of 2 people together in any place. And people must stay 1.5 meters apart. It's interesting, in Germany, it's slightly different to most countries. Like Canada, here in the UK, it's 2 meters. Well, it's 1.5 meters in Germany. So these stores are starting to open. There is a bit of pushback from large retailers like furniture stores and big supermarkets, but some of them are getting around it by opening part of their store that doesn't go above 800 square meters. So that's happening this week. And now Germany has announced that high schools in most states of Germany will open in a couple of weeks from now, from May 4th. So that's how it's starting to open up. But rules in other ways now are being tightened in terms of wearing masks. So in a couple of German states, it is now mandatory to wear a mask on public transit and in stores when you go out from now on. So, but again, it's varying from state to state, depending on what they see and depending on who makes the decisions in these places. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, she strongly advises all citizens to wear masks when they go out, but it is not mandatory. But still in Germany, although many small stores can open, hairdressers and bars and theatres won't be able to open until May the 4th at the earliest. There won't be any sporting events with fans or concerts with fans until the end of August. Although the German Soccer League could start as early as May 9th without fans, that's still to be decided. And in Berlin, Obviously, being a densely crowded city, it's a little slower than in other places. So it very much depends. The most populous state, North Rhine-Westphalia, which is, for want of a better phrase, the GTA of Germany. It is all these cities, basically one megacity that goes on forever. That is the most populous state. The head of that state, the premier there, said that there will be some restrictions in place all the way into 2021. So although this is starting, there is no end in sight, according to many leaders in Germany.
Mm-hmm. And just to pick up on a couple of things that you said, they're opening schools for older students first, as opposed to other countries that are opening elementary schools first. And I'm just wondering, why have they decided to do that? Do you know?
Well, that's very interesting, as you say, yeah, because Denmark is opening elementary schools right now. So the reason that the Danish Prime Minister said they want to open these elementary schools and get younger kids into school is because they want to get these parents available to go back to work and reopen the economy. But in Germany, the theory is somewhat different, that understandably getting small kids to stay 2 meters apart or 1.5 meters apart is not easy. But these elementary schools in Denmark are opening. All the desks are being placed 2 meters apart, and the kids are being supervised, one would hope, in a way that avoids any contact. But as you can imagine, getting elementary school kids to stay apart when they've just met up again for the first time in a month is going to be very difficult. So in Germany, their theory is that older kids are easier to manage. But in Denmark, it's about economics. It's getting those parents who need those kids looked after, getting them back into the workforce. So it's slightly different strategies between Denmark and Germany when it comes to schools.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the other thing that I wanted to ask you about was, there are certain businesses that are allowed to open irrespective of size, like auto showrooms, bike shops, bookshops. And these things don't strike me as essential businesses. And I'm just wondering, is there a logic behind allowing these businesses to reopen early? Is it all about just giving people their income back?
I think it's definitely part of it, but I think it's very much these are down to individual political decisions in certain parts too, because parliaments aren't sitting, but it is depending on what is seen as a priority. When the lockdown began in the UK, it was a little bit vague as to one essential business. And one large sports store here in the UK, Sports Direct, a well-known sports chain, the owners said they think they need to stay open as an essential service to keep the nation healthy. Well, there was a public backlash, and that company decided not to open. So it's not just a government decision, but it's also public pressure and the appetite for what is seen as an essential service. And that is varying from country to country.
Yeah, that's interesting. I also read in Italy that they're allowing bookstores to reopen because I think the culture minister said that reading is essential to people who still have to stay at home. But a lot of these booksellers have come out and said, we don't think we should be reopening. It's still too early.
Yeah, and you can understand it. A lot of bookstores, independent bookstores in particular, are quite small. And to have people inside, it's going to be difficult to socially distance as well. But of course, you don't have to reopen as a business owner. So that's down to the individual businesses as well. But yeah, it was prioritized in Italy that small stores like bookstores and also stores for baby clothing, which you can imagine if the baby is very young, it's going to grow over this period. You're going to need to buy replacement clothes. And that is something that was seen as a priority. So again, it changes from country to country. Of course, one thing that's we see in many countries is that liquor stores are usually exempt and allowed to open as well. You could argue they're not essential services. So it depends who's making those decisions ultimately. There's no hard and fast rule on this, of course, because we've never really been here before.
How did Germany decide that it was time to start easing restrictions?
Well, it was very much on the numbers and on the science. So Germany has had a huge number of cases. It's, among the top 6 to 8 in the world. So 145,000 cases so far and more than 4,500 deaths. So that's per capita. That is a significantly higher number of cases than Canada. The cases per million people in Germany is about double Canada, but the death rate is around similar to Canada. And those numbers obviously are very serious and a huge number, but that curve is dropping and the number of new cases is getting lower and is leveling off. And lawmakers are confident that that means that they can slowly reopen things while keeping those social distance rules in place in order to get things back on their feet. And it's not just the economy, it is social unrest too. So we've seen what's happened in the United States over the past few days.
Open up California now, Newsom, now, right now.
On Saturday in Berlin, there was a protest. A few hundred people, a number of them arrested by police, who were protesting against the measures. And you got to remember why that might be a thing in Berlin. It's not that long ago, 3 decades ago, when you had the secret police in Berlin telling people where to go, monitoring people's every movement. You can understand why Berliner's spirit is very much pushing back against that now. It was just a few hundred people. But that element also exists in Germany. You might imagine Germans like to follow the rules, as the stereotype goes, but obviously there is that spirit there too, that you don't want to be told what to do.
And the other thing I guess we should note is that Germany's healthcare system wasn't overwhelmed the way that Italy's was because of the way that they were able to contain the virus, right?
Yeah, that's right. And throughout this, over the past month, you saw a number of instances where critical patients were being transported from Italy to Germany to be treated in Germany. And Germany's healthcare system is very robust. It is one of the best in Europe. And the fact, I think part of the reason is that Germany got their lockdown going earlier compared to Italy and Spain. When you talk about the initial few cases that were spotted, Germany got in there quicker and perhaps saw what was unfolding in Spain and Italy and managed to prevent this from being catastrophic, as it has been in Spain and Italy. Having said that, of course, 4,500 Germans have died from this.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't know that. I didn't know that Italians were being brought to Germany to be treated. That's really interesting. Another thing I just wanted to note really quickly is that Germany is testing around 120,000 people a day with the aim of tracing every infection chain, according to Angela Merkel.
A draft document seen by Reuters details Germany's multi-step plan to end its lockdown and that its government assumes the global pandemic will last into 2021. The document predicts a staged return to normality, backed by mechanisms that will make it possible to track more than 80% of people an infected person had contact with within 24 hours of diagnosis.
And they're hoping to sample the population for antibodies in the coming months to see how widely the virus has actually spread and whether the society is developing an immunity, because that's obviously important to know when you're making decisions about reopening public life. And there are a few studies happening across the country that are testing people's blood for signs of antibodies, although there is no definitive proof yet that antibodies mean that you're immune to the virus. And even if you are, it's not known how long that immunity might last.
Absolutely. And I think even if there's a lot of information missing, there's so much we don't know about this virus now. I think the more testing that's done, the better, even if scientists know that some of the tests aren't fully reliable or we don't know what to necessarily do with them. The more information that the government has, the better that they can tackle it, regardless of how much we don't know.
So this is all happening in Germany after Denmark and Austria have loosened some of their restrictions.
Yeah, Denmark has these daycares and elementary schools open. There is a lot of concern among parents. In Denmark, there's a Facebook group called, it translates roughly as "My kid is not going to be a guinea pig." It has 40,000 members.
We keep the kids home because the situation in the daycares before the COVID-19 outbreak, I don't think that was okay. And the conditions they're setting up now, I think they're even worse.
And there is a lot of concern that parents see the kids as transmitters. So there's a lot of concern in Denmark that this is too soon, but the government is going ahead with it. So there is some pushback in Denmark. Denmark is taking some cues from its neighbour Sweden. Sweden has kept schools open throughout this. Now, it hasn't appeared to have made a huge difference on the number of infections per capita, although the number of deaths, the death rate in Sweden is noticeably higher, but the number of infections isn't particularly higher. So that's why Denmark is taking that cue from its Scandinavian neighbour to reopen the schools and feeling safe that it's not going to make a huge impact if these schools are now open. We don't know what this means, but over the coming months, I guess when we look back, we'll know if this is a good decision or not. But they feel confident that they can do it. Denmark, interestingly, unlike Germany too, so Germany doesn't have hairdressers, hair salons and tattoo parlors open. Denmark now does.
Yeah, apparently as soon as they announced that they were reopening hair salons, the biggest hair appointment booking system in the country crashed. I guess people are really desperate at this point to get a haircut.
Well, we've all seen the videos and photos on social media of people cutting their own hair or having their family members cut their hair.
Yeah.
And you can understand that people are crying out for it. So that's certainly a priority for many people.
And so this is all happening as the number of active cases in Denmark has gone down in recent days. Their death rate is much lower than other European countries, and their hospital admissions and patients in ICU have gone down since the beginning of the month. So that's, I guess, like the context in which they're loosening some of these restrictions.
For us, it's, of course, I don't know how people are going to react to reopening a restaurant if people still going to stay home. Personally, I wouldn't maybe go out to eat right now, even though they opened up, because I think the fear of having this disease or getting sick is too big. So even though they're going to open up, it's not going to be beneficial for anyone.
What about Italy? Italy had a very severe outbreak, almost 170,000 people infected and more than 22,000 people killed by this virus. But it seems like things have started to slowly improve there. And last week they had their lowest number of reported new cases. What can you tell me about Italy's plans?
Well, Italy's government has extended the closure of non-essential businesses until at least May 3rd, but they're allowing small businesses that feel that they are essential services or part of an essential chain of services in the country to apply to reopen. But because so many of those businesses exist and want to reopen, there has been such a backlog that the government has said, okay, you can all reopen pending approval. And there's been more than 100,000 applications for that. Some of them have already been denied, but many of these businesses have now opened and are now opening in order to get back on their feet. So Italy is obviously facing this crisis from a different perspective compared to places like Austria and Germany. It has been so devastating for Italy. The reports of what went on there are truly remarkable and almost apocalyptic, especially from northern Italy. But it will be, I would say, a couple of weeks before we see any true reopening in Italy. But some businesses are now getting back on their feet. And as I mentioned, bookstores were given that exemption and baby clothing stores. And it's going to take some time because Italy has been hit so hard by this virus.
Yeah. And I know there are doctors there who are really worried about a second wave, and hospitals are now bracing themselves for that. I saw this one doctor quoted in a Time magazine piece, and he was saying that he's already seeing parks and streets full of people. Any other countries that you want to talk about before we move on, I guess?
One interesting thing in Spain is that from next week, kids will be allowed out because kids have actually been on full lockdown. So that doesn't apply, obviously, to most countries. But in Spain, kids have not been allowed out of even to go shopping or anything unless it's a medical emergency. So next Monday, they're deciding that kids will finally be allowed out in a supervised fashion. They don't even know the rules yet, but they say that the mental health consequences for kids after this, could be considerable. And getting the kids some fresh air is seen as very important. So that's one issue that's been seen in Spain that perhaps is rearing its head there and might not be as big a deal elsewhere.
We'll be right back. All these countries have been doing different things, and the situation looks different right now in terms of how much they've managed to get this virus under control. Has there been any kind of coordination between all these different countries about how to reopen and when to do it?
There has been some coordination between G7 leaders and between European Union members in Europe, but for the most part, the decisions that have been done in isolation. And that is difficult because, as you know, in the European Union, there is freedom of movement for the most part within most of the European Union, particularly on continental Europe between France and Italy and Spain and Germany, Netherlands and all these countries. You can freely move between them. But obviously that has had to change. And that is a very difficult thing to monitor when normally you have these open borders where people are allowed to freely move, and now they're locked down to their households. So if one country has a certain type of lockdown and its neighbor has a different lockdown, then that's an issue. And there have been tensions about that. And in one case, it's the UK and Ireland share the border in Northern Ireland, and that's an open border. Schools in the Republic of Ireland closed before Northern Ireland. And there was a political tug of war about getting them closed in Northern Ireland there. And because part of the issue is that some people live on one side of the border and kids go to the school on the other side of the border. So what's the point in closing schools if kids are crossing over and back during the day? So that was an issue when the lockdown was happening. And it certainly is going to rear its head in different European countries when things start opening up again, particularly when it comes to schools and businesses. If you're locking yourself down, but your neighbors are opening up and there's freedom of movement, then what's the point? Now, the European Union effectively closed its external border to outsiders for non-essential travel around that time too. But within the EU, you had states like Poland and Hungary shut their own borders and impose border controls where there previously hadn't been some. And there is going to be pressure on those countries when things start loosening up, perhaps to open it up, because it goes against the very ethos of the European Union to have these closed borders.
So I just can't help but compare Canada's provinces to European countries. Every province has its own rules right now, and you have BC, which has had some success in containing the spread of COVID-19, for example, already talking about reopening schools and businesses unlike the rest of the country. And I'm just wondering, are there any lessons provinces or the federal government can take from Europe as we move towards easing restrictions here in Canada? I'm just wondering if it makes sense for BC to do that with uncontrolled borders, because provincial borders haven't been closed here.
That's, I think, a significant thing to watch out for, because if people are allowed to freely leave their homes, then people are allowed to freely move. Obviously, within Canada, you're not going to have border checks between Alberta and BC, just as is going to be impossible to, for example, to have border checks between Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland, or all of the border crossings between France and Germany. It becomes impractical. So you're going to have to see cooperation between European countries, just as you're going to have to see some sort of harmonized cooperation between Canadian provinces. Because I did a story about this a week ago, looking at the rise of COVID-19 in the developing world and the spread of it there. If the rich world, for want of a better term, North America, Europe, Australia, and so on, deals with COVID-19, but poorer countries are ignored and not helped, the virus will take off there, it won't be dealt with there, and then it will spread back to the developed world again. So unless everybody coordinates, it's going to come back everywhere again. So it's hugely important that the world, and not just Canadian provinces or European countries, coordinate, but that the whole world has a unified approach to this. But right now, obviously, it's far from that. And, for all its faults that have been pointed out, the WHO is central to that. And if everybody's not singing from the same hymn sheet, it's going to be really difficult to tackle this in a way that eliminates it as soon as possible.
All right, Redmond, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Tamara.
All right, that's the show. Thanks so much for listening. If you want to know more about Sweden's controversially relaxed approach to COVID-19 that Redmond was talking about, listen to our episode on that from April 8th. And as I mentioned off the top of the show, we'll be covering the Nova Scotia shooting tomorrow, and you can find all our ongoing coverage at globalnews.ca. I'm Tamara Kendacker, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.